Today our keynote speaker is going to be Artisan Basu, who is Chairman and CEO of Sage Policy Group Incorporated, an economic and policy consulting firm headquartered in Baltimore, Maryland. With an office in Orlando, Florida, the firm provides strategic analytical services to energy suppliers, law firms, medical systems, government agencies, and real estate developers, amongst others. In 2014, Maryland Governor Larry Hogan appointed him chair of the Maryland Economic Development Commission until 2021. He serves as chairman of the Baltimore County Economic Advisory Committee. He also serves the chief economist function for the Associated Builders and Contractors, the Construction Financial Management Association, the Modular Building Institute, the Maryland Bankers Association, and several others. He has taught at several universities, most frequently at the Johns Hopkins University. He currently teaches history and economic thought at Goucher College as their distinguished economist in residence. In 2007, 2016, and 2022, the Daily Record newspaper selected Dr. Basu as one of Maryland's 50 most influential people. The Baltimore Business Journal named him one of the region's 20 most powerful business leaders in 2010. Dr. Basu is currently on the boards of the University of Maryland School of Law, St. Mary's College, the University of Maryland Medical Center, the University System of Maryland Foundation, the Lyric Opera House, and the Archdiocese of Baltimore School System. He is also on Truist Bank's advisory board. Dr. Basu earned his Bachelor's of Science in Foreign Service at Georgetown University. He's earned his Master's in Public Policy from Harvard University's John F. Kennedy School of Government, and his Master's in Economics from the University of Maryland, College Park. He acquired his Juris Doctor at the University of Maryland School of Law. He completed his doctoral work at UMBC with a concentration in health economics. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me cheer on Dr. Artisan Basu.
Right, thank you very much. Can you hear me? We're going to talk about the economy today, where we are in the business cycle. I actually received some fairly interesting data regarding the economy this morning. I'll talk a bit about that, of course. My presentation today is entitled The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. This is a Clint Eastwood-themed presentation. You'll see that theme throughout the presentation, whether you like it or not. I hope you don't hate it, but it's firmly baked in the cake. And this morning I have the privilege of sharing with you some good, some bad, and some ugly. I'll be talking a lot about the U.S. economy, but of course talk about some other aspects of the world economy, including, of course, some slides specific to the Canadian economy. And so let me begin with the discussion of the good. Oh, I should point this way. And it has been a lot of good. North America has continued to expand economically, and this has been a surprise to many. If we focus on the U.S. economy, there has been a conventional wisdom that recession was inevitable in America. And actually that was the expectation coming into last year, coming to 2023, that recession was coming to the United States of America. And of course, the Canadian economy and others would be affected by American economic weakness. Indeed, the economists at Bloomberg, a source of phenomenal business intelligence, maintained a forecasting index. And as of October of 2022, that index was suggesting that the probability of recession in America was 100%. And you may be aware that that's the highest possible probability, that in fact you cannot get beyond 100% unless you talk about the Baltimore Ravens defense, which actually per gives 110%. But otherwise, 100% is most. 2022 was a terrible year for the U.S. equity markets. It was also a terrible year if you don't like higher interest rates, as interest rates took off. We'll talk about interest rates in both the United States and Canada later on in the presentation. And these are thought to be precursors to a broad-based economic downturn. Simply has not occurred. The U.S. economy and other economies have continued to expand. This is projected growth for various parts of the global economy in 2024, the current year. These data come from the International Monetary Fund. I know there are a lot of bad things happening in the world, politically, geopolitically, meteorologically, so on and so forth, but the world economy is still expanding. According to the International Monetary Fund, the global economy will expand a bit more than 3% this year. Not fabulous performance. Indeed, anything below 3% global economic growth is often deemed to be global economic recession. But the top half of the slide, below that, that's the advanced economies of the world. There's 30-some of them. You can see the outlook for the U.S. economy there. This is the U.S. economy this year to grow 2.6%. Perfectly accurate performance. The Canadian economy is a bit softer for reasons we're going to get into, 1.3%, but it's growing. If you look at the bottom half of the slide, that's the emerging economies of the world. The Indians leading the way, 7.3% expected growth this year. Now the fifth largest economy in the world, the Chinese economy growing a bit softer, second largest economy in the world, 5%. But the world economy is expanding, despite all the bad news that we hear. And the United States in particular has been the envy of the advanced world in terms of its pace of growth. You can see here, this is for the United States, gross domestic product data. This is the broadest indication of ongoing U.S. economic progress. Growth in national output is measured by GDP. Quarterly data, annualized rates of growth. Now, we are in the fourth quarter, of course, of 2024, but the last data point we have from the Bureau of Economic Analysis is for the second quarter. We don't yet have third quarter GDP data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So if you look to the right, much of the data I'll show you this morning are time series data, so the more contemporary data to the right of the slide. If you look to the right, during that second quarter, the U.S. economy expands 3% at an annualized rate. That's perfectly adequate performance, quite strong, and again, above expectations. The U.S. economy has surprised to the upside. Now, the Atlanta Federal Reserve maintains a product known as GDP now, which estimates current foreign gross domestic products. And so, because we have not yet received third quarter data, statistically, we're still in the third quarter. Their estimate for the quarter is the U.S. economy grew 3.2% on an annualized basis for the third quarter. Actually, these rates are above trend. And certain parts of the economy have performed particularly well. And at the heart of that statement is the American consumer, here retail sales. The consumer's been on a spending tear. Retail sales, the last two bars here are July and August, perfectly adequate. And actually much of the growth in consumer outlays recently has not been on retail items here depicted, but on services, things like travel. So if we're going to go to the Philadelphia International Airport, not so far from here, I guarantee it's going to be busy. And lines are going to be long. Every once in a while, the Americans will set a new record for the number of people passing through TSA checkpoints on a single day. The Americans are spending on Beyonce concert tickets, Taylor Swift concert tickets. In August of 2023, the average Taylor Swift concert ticket purchased on resale, that's how we'll buy them on resale, sold for $1,619 per ticket. And she sold out football stadiums multiple times in the same city. She just toured Australia, by the way. The Australian government thanked her for coming and improving their economy. She generated about $400 million in economic impact in about 4 days. She's not merely a musical phenomenon, she's an economic one. And I would say to you that this thing between her and Travis Kelce is pretty much the greatest thing ever. This is fantastic, it's phenomenal, it is not at all annoying. And what you have here is this hunky athlete from the Kansas City Chiefs, three-time Super Bowl winning tight end Travis Kelce, in a relationship with the savvy singer-songwriter Taylor Swift. There are pictures of them, of course, kissing on the internet. Now, some of that's artificially generated, but it has many Americans aglow, abuzz, and hopeful, and there's reason for hope. Because unlike many stories, this stands to end quite well, because when that breakup occurs, and it will occur, she is going to leave him. The music is going to flow, and I, for one, cannot wait. Now, I wouldn't make the case that the American consumer, and I would say the Canadian consumer as well, but we'll talk about Canada more in a moment, cannot spend in this fashion. And at the heart of that statement is American demography, demographics. America, of course, is a phenomenally wealthy nation. But that wealth is not particularly evenly distributed. So here I'm using Federal Reserve data just to show you where the wealth in America resides. So I'm stacking the most affluent households in America down to the least affluent. I'm trying to figure out where the wealth exists. Now, if you look at that teal color at the very top of the slide, that's the wealth controlled by the top 0.1% of Americans. There are about 335,000 of them. And in the aggregate, they control around 13.5% of America's wealth, the top 0.1%. If you look at the balance of the top 1%, so that's your 99th percentile to 99.9th percentile, that's featured here in green, they control another 16.7% of the nation's wealth. So the top 1% of Americans control a bit more than 30% of the nation's wealth. They are phenomenally wealthy by domestic and global standards. Now, if you look at the balance of the top 10%, so that's your 90th percentile to your 99th percentile, that's featured in that yellow stripe there, they control another 36.5% of the nation's wealth. So the top 10% controls almost precisely 2/3 of America's wealth. If you look at the brown segment below that, that's wealth controlled by the 50th percentile to the 90th percentile, so that's 40% of America's population, and that 40% controls about 30.5% of the nation's wealth, 30.8% to be more precise, which means that the bottom 50% of Americans controls about 2.5% of the nation's wealth. So top 50%, 97.5%, bottom 50%, 2.5% of the nation's wealth. So a lot of these Americans do not have much financial wealth. Some of that wealth is in their homes. So some of these folks are homeowners. The U.S. homeownership rate is well above 60%. But they don't have financial wealth. They live from paycheck to paycheck. Well, here's the good news about that. There have been lots of paychecks in America. This is from the JOLTS, the Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey. As of August, there were 8.04 million available unfilled jobs in America. America is still home to more job openings than unemployed people. It's been a very strong labor market. And of course, one of the things that we observed both in the United States and in Canada is that labor has flexed its musculature in the last few years, in part because it's been such a strong labor market, because there's been a shortage of human capital. For many of you operating businesses, you may agree with the statement, my number one challenge is finding good people to do the work. I got deal flow. I'm having a tough time finding service-oriented, committed, devoted, reliable people. And this has been true across North America, of course, but in other parts of the world as well. So, for instance, last year we had strikes among actors and writers. That's one of the reasons we did not have an early summer blockbuster movie this year in the United States. So last year we had Barbie and Oppenheimer, quite different films, by the way, but both hits. This year it took a long time before it got a first hit this summer. Happened to be Deadpool and Wolverine. I take both of them for that, but we did not generate as much content during the strike. We had strikes, of course, in the United States and Canada among UAW members, not auto workers members. Of course, we just had the recent lockout of railroad workers at 2 major Canadian railroads. So a lot of strife out there. We have a strike at Boeing right now involving the machinists union. They're not even going on for several weeks now. They're not getting done to negotiate. We just had last week the strike among the International Longshoremen's Association, as everyone knows, just lasted 3 days. But again, 61% raise over the next 6 years for that group. So labor has been flexing its musculature. Some negotiations last year did not end in strikes. Let me give you an example. The negotiations between United Parcel Service, UPS, and the Teamsters Union, those negotiations produced a 5-year agreement, and during the 5th year of that agreement, the average full-time UPS truck driver will be earning $170,000 US. Now that's wages plus benefits, up to $170K, forcing people like myself to ask the question, how do I look in brown? And based on the app, spectacular, but the point is, that is great for consumption. So why not focus so much on consumption or consumer spending? Because that's 2/3 of the economy right there. And 2/3 of active demand is the American consumer. And something very similar happens in Canada as well. Another, generally speaking, consumer-led economy, though commodities and other forms of production play a relatively larger role in the Canadian economy than the US economy. Nonetheless, lots of job openings, and when a nation enters each and every month with unfilled job openings, it's quite likely that that nation is going to add jobs in the ensuing month, which is exactly what America's been doing since December of 2020. So whether it's been wildfires or hurricanes or other congressional elections, bridge collapses, America's managed to add jobs every month since December of 2020. The last reading here happens to come from September. In September, America adds 254,000 jobs according to the preliminary estimate. Now, like any data, you'll want to take this with a grain of salt, maybe 5, 6, 7, or 8 grains of salt. You may have heard that the Bureau of Statistics, which produces these data, recently revised their estimates for job growth for the 1 year ended in March by 818,000. And the confidence band around that 254,000 estimate for September is 134,000 jobs in either direction. So there's some wall there in the data. There's something for revision. Nonetheless, many employers with whom I speak will tell me we're still looking for talent. We'd love to upgrade our talent. It's a hard labor market for us to operate in, whether it's construction firms, manufacturers, others. Talk more about manufacturers go through this presentation, obviously. So again, really very good for consumption dynamics, retail spending dynamics, and of course there have been certain parts of the United States that have expanded faster than others. I will tell you that we're going to get a jobs report on November 1st, and it's not going to be very good. And that has everything to do with Hurricane Milton. So as it turns out, timing matters. This is so-called reference week for the establishment survey. This is the week during which businesses are surveyed about how many people are working on a particular day. Well, of course, with so much of Florida evacuated and dislocated, we might actually see a jobs report on November 1st, which is quite negative. And that jobs report will come out 4 days before the election. And so that might have some influence on the election, believe it or not. So we'll see. But the last jobs report, again, the jobs report that we received earlier this month for September was very, very good. And again, certain parts of the United States have performed better than others. So these are the 25 largest metropolitan areas in America. What I'm doing for you here is I'm looking at job growth, percentage job growth from February of 2020. Why that month? That's the last month before the U.S. economy is shut down. So public health emergency in America is declared on March 13th of 2020. So I'm using February of 2020 as the pre-pandemic level of employment for these 25 major metropolitan areas, and comparing the job totals for February of 2020 against what they were in August of 2024, the last month for which we have some national data. If you look at the left-hand column, these are the regions that have added the jobs the fastest in percentage terms. There's a neat correspondence or correlation between population growth and job growth. In recent years, no region of America has added more people in absolute terms than the Dallas metropolitan area. By the way, no region of the country overpays their quarterback as much as the Dallas metropolitan area. I'm persuaded that these things are purely coincidental. But you'll notice that the American South, it's Dallas, Tampa. Interesting Tampa, of course, hit by this hurricane quite hard. As you know, the roof blew off their baseball stadium overnight. San Antonio, Charlotte, Orlando, Phoenix, Houston, Atlanta, Miami. That's where the population growth has been, that's where the job growth has been. The Northeast corridor is mostly on the right-hand column, less population growth, less job growth, so metropolitan areas like New York, Washington, Boston, my town of Baltimore, but also some of the huge markets of the American Midwest, Chicagoland, Detroit, and Minneapolis, also not right-hand column. Again, less population growth, less job. And I find this slide to be quite interesting, perhaps even compelling. The next slide is far more important macroeconomically. Same 25 major metropolitan areas, but instead of employment growth, these are rates of unemployment. And now you're seeing a new dynamic in the data. Yes, the unemployment rate nationally, 4.1%, but in some regions of the United States, you're starting to see unemployment really surge higher. If you look toward the bottom of the right-hand column there, you'll note certain unemployment rates now above 6%. That's not particularly low. This labor market is loosening up. And I'm going to make the case later on in the presentation, unemployment begets unemployment, but let me not get ahead of myself. So you look at Los Angeles, 6.2%, that's a massive market, of course. You've got a fair number of unemployed people now there. Riverside, California, also another large market, 6%. Chicagoland, 5.7%, so on and so forth. New York Metro, biggest market ever, 5.3%. So one of the things that you would expect going forward is that consumer spending might not be quite as strong as unemployment continues to be more apparent, at least in certain parts of the country. And we see some similar dynamics, as it turns out, in Canada. If you look provincially at the data, unemployment rate by province, you can see the overall national unemployment rate in August of 2024 for the Canadians, 6.6%. You can see in Newfoundland and Labrador, 10.4%, Prince Edward Island, 8.2%, but Alberta, that's obviously a very populated province, 7.7%. Ontario, the most populated, 7.1%. Not particularly low. What I'm trying to say is that we've been in this environment in which we've had this virtuous cycle in which consumer spend, impact employers higher, which of course fuels further spending. But you're starting to see some cracks in that armor. And that takes me, as it turns out, to the bad. Is this recovery in North America sustainable? Now, many of you would say to me, as manufacturers, we've been in recession, sir. I mean, you've been talking about economic growth, But you may have noticed that the Institute for Supply Management's Purchasing Managers Index for manufacturing has been below 50 for months. And that in Canada, factory sales have been down since roughly May of last year, fair enough. It has been a service sector-led economy in recent months in both the United States and Canada. And that service sector depends heavily upon the consumer. That consumer depends heavily upon ongoing strength of the labor market. And that creates some questions. So let's start this part of the story by, again, focusing on the consumer. Now, this is for the United States. These data come from the San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank. This is personal savings, measured in hundreds of billions of dollars, US dollars. Today, the Canadian dollar can buy a bit less than 73 cents, but we'll talk about maybe currency later on in the presentation. So if you look at the green line there at the bottom of the slide, that is personal savings, again, measured in hundreds of billions of dollars. And you can see a reasonably smooth trajectory in personal savings as we head toward the pandemic. But then the pandemic changed everything. Because during the pandemic, many Americans received stimulus payments, many business operators received paycheck protection payments. Many American workers experienced meaningful compensation increase during the pandemic, and of course, we thank them for working through the pandemic, whether it's pharmacies or construction job sites or whatever it happened to be. But that meant that income was rising for many Americans precisely as their expenditures were falling. Because they weren't taking vacations, not going to movie theaters, not seeing plays, not seeing Beyonce or Taylor Swift in concert, even Ice Spice or SZA. And so according to San Francisco Federal Reserve Bank economists, they amassed a lot of excess savings, meaning savings above and beyond what they would have saved but for the pandemic. And according to those economists, they amassed about $2.1 trillion in excess savings. According to those same economists, by the middle part of this year, all of those savings and then some had been spent. Now, as that money was spent, of course, it juiced the US economy. So if you look at the quarterly GDP data, 4.9% growth in the third quarter of last year, 3.4% in the fourth quarter. Yeah, the American consumer was on a spending tear, but now the money's gone. And so what you're left with in many cases is an American consumer who has spent down their pandemic-era savings and continues to face high rising prices as measured, for instance, by the Consumer Price Index. Inflation data, 12% change in prices measured by the CPI. Unfortunately, we received some data this morning at 8:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. I was not able to update the slide in time, but we now have new data for September. I can walk you through that in a second. But the green line there represents the overall rate of inflation. So what it says is that between August of 2023 and August of 2024, overall inflation in America 2.5%. Now, we got data today indicating that inflation is now, on a year-over-year basis, now that would be September of last year to September of this year, 2.4%. Okay. There's another line over there. It's a dark blue line. That's your so-called core rate inflation. Inflation minus food and energy prices. And often economists like looking at core rates of inflation because food and energy prices can be influenced by non-economic factors like weather and geopolitics. So to get a pure measure of economic inflation, sometimes we look at that core measure, again, that's that dark blue, and that says inflation between August of last year and August of this running at 3.2%, but we got a figure for that today. Core inflation now on a year-over-year basis up 3.3%, according to today's data. Today's inflation came in a bit hotter because of food prices and shelter. And let me break this down for you. So the effect of this inflation is cumulative. A lot of economists say, look, the inflation rate is falling. The Federal Reserve and the Bank of Canada have been reducing interest rates recently because the inflation data become more benign. But prices are still rising and off a high base. And at least in the United States of America, we've been dealing with this excess inflation, the inflation above the Federal Reserve's 2% target, since at least early 2021. So let me take you back in time a little bit. Let me take you back to May of 2020. Again, US data. Why May of 2020? That's the first month of the current economic expansion. So America loses 22 million jobs in March and April of 2020. We begin to add back jobs in May of 2020. So if you look at price levels as they were, as measured by the Consumer Price Index in May of 2020, and compare those to August of 2024, again, I'll update the data for September's data, and I'll do that later on, but headline numbers are down below. Overall inflation in about 4.25 year comparison period here, 23% in America. Strip out food and energy prices, still lofty 20%, in a country that aspires to 2% inflation per annum. Now, categorically, you can see in green, Energy prices are more than 50%. Transportation services prices are more than 40%. It'll been more than 4 years. Well, of course. If you're going to pay the UPS truck driver that much money, someone's going to pay for that, and it's often the consumer. That's inflationary. That's that wage price spiral people talk about. I do not begrudge the UPS driver that level of compensation, not at all. These are very special people. Have to be able to drive a large vehicle, have to be able to park it, have to lift heavy objects all day long, as much as 70 pounds, and pass a drug test. Most Americans cannot do all of those things. Nonetheless, that's inflationary. Shelter, up 24%. That includes things like apartment rents. Food prices, and this is what I think has Americans most upset. People ask me all the time, Aniban, why do Americans drive angry? Because they're angry. You just see them when they're driving. And this is the thing that has the most upset. One of the things I do as an economist, I talk to a lot of Americans about the economy. And often this takes place in rides with Uber and Lyft. So many of you, of course, take Ubers and Lyfts, at least in the United States. I'm not sure if Lyft is in Canada. But, those of you who do this know that as a passenger, you rate the driver, you may be less what the driver rates you as a passenger. And I have become very recently privy to my passenger ratings, and they're extremely low. And you say, that makes sense, or we're going to watch you speak for about 20 minutes now. I think this is beyond my personality. Any defects there? There's something else afoot. So I take every Uber or Lyft trip as an opportunity to interview an American. And I'll ask the question and I'll do this from the back seat, obviously, hey, how much do you really make on an hourly basis once you factor in insurance and depreciation costs? What's your highest level of education attainment? What other options did you have? Did you have it? Does your family approve? Do you have a girlfriend? Why would you choose this vehicle in particular? And apparently these questions are off-putting. But when you ask people about the economy, they'll say, this is the number they have to be upset. This is a lot of people in Washington, D.C. surprised. People in Washington, D.C. will say, look, we had new records on the S&P 500 and Dow Jones Industrial Average yesterday. Dow was up over 400 points, now neatly above 42,000. They're down this morning. We have 4.1% unemployment, quite low by historical standards. We have 8 million available unfilled jobs. We've had rapid wage growth in recent years. Travel spending has never been higher. What are Americans upset about right here? They can't keep up with these prices, but they try. Because once you establish a certain standard of living, once you have a certain size of apartments, you go to a certain class of restaurants, you have a certain type of vacation, you don't want to give that up, even if it's for ostensibly temporary factors like stimulus payments. But now, the pandemic or savings are gone, and the prices keep rising, so what do people do? Well, of course, they turn to the credit card. New York Reserve Bank data, credit card debt in America. And it is surging. Now, again, many economists will say, look, this boss is making too big a deal out of this. It's rising, but he has not adjusted his data for inflation. If he adjusted his data for inflation, look much better. Fair point. That notwithstanding, however, Americans are having a tougher time fulfilling their basic financial obligations. This is the percentage of balances 30 plus days liquid by loan type. Is delinquency, unpaid bills. The green line there is credit card delinquency, and it's rising. Now, again, people say, it's rising, but off a low level. So we had other moments in history, this slide happens to go back to 2003, during which delinquency was higher in terms of credit card delinquency, and including non-recessionary period. So it's, at least right now, not a big deal. I view that as the optimistic perspective. But I am no optimist. I am one of the most pessimistic people you will ever encounter. Didn't have a girlfriend in high school, didn't really have one in college. I'm from Baltimore. So I expect bad things happen all the time. And I look at that trend, and it's ominous. And by the way, not in isolation. The yellow line, there's auto loan delinquency. It's rising. At the bottom, toward the bottom in brown, that's your mortgage delinquency. Okay, yes, fair enough. It's rising, but off a very low level, historically speaking. But if more Americans are missing their mortgage payment, that tells us that's a pretty important payment to miss. That financial stress, generated at least in part by all of this inflation we've seen in the last few years, is starting to move up the socioeconomic ladder. I'm not saying this means that recession is imminent in America, not at all. What I'm saying to you is that the consumer, that 70% of the economy that is the American consumer, cannot be spent in this fashion. That is implicated for all kinds of things, including non-OEMs, but many, many others throughout the economy. So, now, I have to say that this surprised me, the behavior of the American consumer in particular. I did not expect the 2023 economy or the 2024 economy to be so good. And much of my surprise relates to the willingness of consumers to spend as they have. Because I was taught in school that the most important price in the economy is the interest rate. So this is, as it turns out, commercial bank rates on, or interest rates on credit card loans. It's credit card interest rates. And so when over the last couple of years, the Federal Reserve Bank of Canada has maintained, generally speaking, a tighter monetary policy, posture. So what was I thinking naively? That American consumers facing these higher borrowing costs would borrow less, would spend less aggressively. No, they spent regularly. There's a phenomenon called buy now, pay later. Buy now, pay later. And some of these companies, like Affirm, if you've heard of this company, I don't mean to pick on them, but they're sort of the best of their breed. They're a lender to consumers. They don't report credit rating agencies. So there's lots of buy now, pay later built into the U.S. economy. Americans can handle buy now. I think we're the best in the world in buy now. It's the pay later part that can be problematic. You can see that from the delinquency rates. And so we've got a lot of that pay later built into the economy, again, suggesting that the consumer can actually spend it this way. Now, a lot of this weakness has been engineered, by the way, by policymakers in Washington, D.C. There's a group of policymakers in Washington, D.C. that want to generate deteriorating economic outcomes. They want to slow down the economy, to bring inflation to their 2% target. I speak, of course, to the folks of the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States. This is the principal mechanism to influence economic growth, and it's byproduct of inflation. The so-called federal funds rate, also known as the Fed funds rate, also known, aka the overnight bank lending rate. This is the rate at which banks can borrow from one another overnight. Why would a bank do that? Because banks have a certain amount of reserves inside the bank to make loans outside of it, and occasionally banks run up against that constraint. When this rate is set at a low level, banks are more likely to borrow from one another, thereby shoring up their reserves, thereby lending more aggressively in the economy. When this rate is set at a relatively high level, banks are less likely to engage in such behaviors. Now, again, this burst of inflation in the United States shows up in early 2021. Federal Reserve sees in the data, we all do. Supply chain issues, etc. Red hot economy coming back from the pandemic. But in 2021, the Federal Reserve does precisely nothing about that inflation. They view that inflation to be transitory. A synonym for transitory is fleeting. They think it's almost purely supply chain driven. That as supply chains normalize post-pandemic, as employers rehire their employees, supply will rise to meet demand, and inflation is naturally gained to that 2% level we'd enjoyed for many years pre-pandemic. Instead, the Federal Reserve helps to preside over that wage price spiral. So prices take off in early 2021. Early 2021, employees notice, boss, I need a raise. My life is getting more expensive. Boss says, no problem, I'll give you your raise. I need you. There's also some unmet demand out there. Economies come back very, very quickly. I'll just pass on my cost increases to my customers and clients. Wage price spiral. Now, after about a year of this, the Federal Reserve starts to push back on inflation. March 17th of 2022, they start to raise rates. But even then, they only dip their toes in inflation fighting waters, raising rates on that day by 0.25 percentage points. But next meeting, 0.5 percentage points. Next 4 meetings, consecutively 0.75 percentage points each meeting. Then back to 0.5%. Then back to 0.25%. Then again, another 0.25%. May 3rd of last year, 0.25%. Pause in June. July 26th of last year, 0.25%. Pause for 8 meetings. September 18th, half-point rate cut. My point to you is simply this. Yeah, stock market was very excited, has been very excited by that rate cut. 50 basis points, half a percentage point. But in the broader scheme of things, it's a small cut relative to the increases of the recent past. So interest rates are still quite high in both the United States and, as it turns out, in Canada, Bank of Canada. Now, even though the Bank of Canada comes in second in terms of sequence of these two slides, actually the Bank of Canada begins to raise rates sooner than the Federal Reserve. They move first, and the Bank of Canada begins to lower rates sooner than the Federal Reserve. They've been ahead of the Federal Reserve in terms of policy making. But the trajectory in terms of interest rates is almost identical. And why do I bring this up? Because there's something called economic theory. I'm going to make the case that the North American economy is going to slow somewhat more going forward. And already we know that the manufacturing segments of both economies have been softening in general. But I want to make the case that the broader economies are going to soften further. Again, a lot of that consideration is based on economic theory. I won't go through this entire slide. But I want to pick out this first bullet. It's a quote from the highly respected, highly regarded president and CEO of the Atlanta Federal Reserve, Raphael Bostic. who says, quote, a large body of research tells us it can take 18 months, 2 years, or more for tighter monetary policy to materially affect inflation, you say, of all the things you've said thus far, that is the most nonsensical. You've said lots of nonsensical things, but that's the most. Because you yourself just said, the Federal Reserve, Bank of the United States, has been raising interest rates since March of 2022, and that over that period, inflation in America went from more than 9%, which is where it was in June of 2022, to more recently less than 3%. And inflation is now down to the point where both the Bank of Canada and the Federal Reserve, inflation is not low enough now that they feel free to cut rates. Clearly, tighter monetary policy has had a material effect on inflation. I'm not saying it hasn't, but I think there's been at least one other factor at work here in terms of shaping economic outcomes in the United States and Canada and other parts of the world over the last 2.5 years. And what is that other factor? It may surprise you. It's improved supply chains. Now, I'm not saying they're perfect. You know they're not. I can see what's happening in South China Sea the way you can. Houthi rebels, Somali pirates, Red Sea, issue with the Suez Canal, low water levels, Panama Canal, bridge collapse in Baltimore, lockout of railroad workers at 2 Canadian railroads, all those things. There's supply chain issues out there still, but supply chains as a general proposition are more reliable than they were late 2021. And here's what happens economically as supply chains improve in the context of unmet demand. Let us take new cars sold in the United States as an example. For a while there, the Americans had a tough time finding new cars in junction lots, not enough computer chips, that kind of thing. So what did the Americans do? They turned to buying used cars. What happened to the price of used cars? Skyrocketed. But then new cars began to show up on dealership lots. All of a sudden, Americans had optionality. And so all of a sudden, used car prices were not rising so quickly. In fact, they've fallen about 10.4% over the past year. Moreover, there was frenzied waiting demand for those new cars. So as they hit the dealership lot, they flew off the lots. So what do you get as supply chains improve in the context of unmet demand? You get tons of transactional volume as that supply meets that waiting demand, and you get less inflation because there's less scarcity in the economy. And that's exactly what we observed in both the United States and Canada over the last couple of years. My feeling is, and again, it's based on economic theory, the theories of Milton Friedman, the great godfather of monetary theory, Anna Schwartz, the great godmother, Deb Bernanke, another amazing monetary theoretician, that some of the effects from these higher interest rates, and yes, they're falling now, but interest rates are still high, have fully permeated the economy. And that the weakness to come in 2025 is going to surprise certain people because of those theoretical, but historically demonstrated flag effects. Now, I'm not saying to you that these higher interest rates have had no effect on the economy. Not at all, no. But let's talk about the housing market. Tier 2 interest rates of interest, 30-year fixed mortgage rate is in blue, 50-year fixed mortgage rate, the lower line there in green. According to Freddie Mac data, these data come from Freddie Mac each week, 30-year fixed mortgage rate in America is 6.12% for last week. Now you can say, surely you're not going to make a big deal, 6.12% 30-year fixed mortgage rates, are you? Because I can remember when mortgage rates were 18% in America. I can remember when they were 15%. Fair enough. But to millennials and Generation Z, the youngest members of America's workforce, these rates are positively high. And that's who's really dropped out of the home purchasing marketplace. It's been that would-be first-time American buyer, frustrated by lack of inventory, high prices, and by their standards, extremely high borrowing costs. Now, to move to the tail end of this presentation, I want to show you a number of leading economic indicators because I want to pivot from a discussion of what's been transpiring to discuss what's likely to happen going forward. Here's a leading indicator. This is the U.S. mortgage loans, U.S. mortgage loan applications composite index. As a leading indicator because often the first step in the home purchasing process is getting a mortgage, that mortgage application. This is the first indication that somebody out there seeks to transact, seeks to get to a settlement table. And as interest rates have been falling recently, mortgage applications have bumped up a bit, but they're about 75% below where they were during the 2021 peak. So what does that tell you? There are far few ready buyers out there, people ready to transact to buy a home. The buying population has shrunk dramatically, again, in part because of these high mortgage rates. You say, housing market will see in terrible shape. And if the buying public has dried up, especially among first-time buyers, housing market must be in terrible shape, but by many measures it is not. Take, for instance, U.S. home sales prices measured by the S&P Case-Share Home Price Index. Home prices in America have never been higher. Which, by the way, lends some credibility to my statement that maybe these higher interest rates have not had that much impact on prices. Because if you ask, what is the one price I'd expect to be most impacted impacted by higher interest rates would be home sales prices. They're at record highs in America. You see there's an increase in home sales prices in the United States during the pandemic, early stages of recovery. That's about a 35% increase in U.S. home sales prices in a very short period of time. And of course, during the pandemic, our behavior changed. Americans wanted more house. We wanted to take advantage of the lowest mortgage rates in the history of the country. We wanted more square footage. We're spending more time at home. We wanted space for home offices and home gyms. We wanted one just for the Peloton. And anytime you see a Peloton advertised, the only piece of furniture in that room is the Peloton. That's how we Americans choose to live. You buy a Peloton, you put it in a room, you lock the door. And then, of course, when people visit, you open up the door, you show them the picture, splash some water on it, that kind of thing. Make it look like it's been used. But then the pandemic ended and mortgage rates took off. So what was I thinking naively? We'd give back a meaningful chunk of those home sales price gains generated during the pandemic. You can see it happened for a few months, but not very long and not very deep. What did I fail to fully appreciate? What did I get wrong analytically? I understood there are fewer buyers in the market. What I failed to fully understand is that there'd be so few sellers out there. Because if you lock in a mortgage in Kankakee, Illinois or Duluth, Minnesota at 2.75% on a 30-year fixed, where are you going? You're not going anywhere. You don't have to be carted out of the house. You don't leave that house in an ambulance. And so you don't have many buyers, you don't have many sellers, high to the price. Now this, of course, impacts construction activity, a source of some interest, I suspect, to some people in this audience. So here is another leading economic indicator. This is U.S. residential building permits. And it's a leading indicator because if you're a builder, you've got to pull permits before you build. The orange line at the top there, that's your single-family building permits. That doesn't look so bad. I mean, if you try to eliminate, sort of from the slide, those boom years, those housing bubble years of 2003, 2004, 2005, when we built too many homes, historically, single-family building permits don't look so bad. You say, how is that possible? You just said the millennials, America's most populous generation, the oldest of that group will turn 44 this year, are having a tough time transacting, high mortgage rates, etc. Why are single-family builders pulling so many permits? Because there's so few existing homes for sale. That single-family builders are finding opportunities to meet unmet demand, including among millennials. If you look at the average size of the newly built or constructed American home, it's shrinking in terms of square footage. Why? Because increasingly home builders are trying to meet millennials where they are financially. That means less square footage, fewer windows, those kinds of things, to bring that price point down into millennial territory. Actual loss of momentum here is in that multifamily category. That relates to future apartment construction. Now, of course, in America, we've built a ton of apartment buildings over the last few years. This relates to the next generation of apartments to be constructed, which is going to be much smaller in amplitude. But you say, why not you buy? If the millennials are having a tough time transacting and buying a home, they have to live someplace. They can't live with their parents forever. They can try, but they shouldn't. They have to live someplace. They're going to lease apartments. Why are multifamily developers, apartment builders, pulling fewer permits? Because increasingly, developers are having a tough time line project finance. So about 18 months ago, we suffered major bank failures at Silicon Valley Bank, March 10th, Signature Bank, March 12th, and all of those episodes had little to do with, if anything, with real estate exposure. Banks have become more cautious in their lending ever since, and regulators have become more aggressive in regulating bank balance sheets and the adoption of risk onto those balance sheets. And this dynamic, the project financing or lack thereof dynamic, extends beyond the multifamily category to include certain segments of commercial real estate. And this stands to impact construction volumes even further, which of course impacts demand for construction equipment. We'll talk about that in just one slide. So this is the Architecture Billings Index. It's a reflection of how busy architects are. You see the 50-yard line running west across that slide. Any reading less than 50 signifies that architects are less busy as a group now than they were the previous month. 13 straight months below 50, architects are getting less busy. And why is that a leading indicator? Because architects are less busy upstream, construction firms are less busy downstream, and construction firms are less busy downstream, they need, all things being equal, less equipment. So if you look at, for instance, the market for used heavy-duty construction equipment, that inventory continues to expand because this part of the economy is starting to slow. According to Sandhills Global's most recent construction market report for medium and heavy-duty construction equipment, used heavy-duty construction equipment inventory, including crawler excavators, dozers, and wheel loaders, has been accumulating on dealers' lots for months. This continued in August with an increase of 2.5% month over month and 20.9% year over year. Conversely, asking values decreased 1.3% month over month and 5.6% year over year and are trending downward, What is that? That is a lag effect for these higher interest rates start to really pervade the economy. And it'll show first in interest rate sensitive segments like real estate and construction. Auction values fell 1.6% month over month and 10.4% year over year as they continue to outpace asking value decreases, maintaining a value gap in this market. And there are certain segments of real estate that are particularly soft, and that brings it to the ugly. And that is the US office market, though you will note that recently, information, I read the Toronto Star as it turns out, that the office vacancy rate in Toronto just reached a 30-year high. So this is beyond the United States of America. But in many American markets, the office market is in terrible shape. Not everywhere. Not everywhere. I just delivered a presentation in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, because that's how glamorous my life is. And I was speaking to a group of commercial real estate developers. And they said, Anirban, we in central Pennsylvania need more office space because we haven't built much office space in this part of the country for many, many decades, and we have got major health systems like Geisinger and others expanding, and they want more space. Okay. But there are certain office markets, particularly in older central business districts and the older buildings therein, in which we see a lot of struggle. So last year, again, the U.S. economy grows 2.5%. It's on pace to grow around that this year, and yet the office vacancy rate in America expanded last year and through the first half of this year, ending the second quarter at 13.9%. Now that 13.9% vacancy rate is a lie. Not because the data are not good. CoStar is very expensive and much respected data, but there's way more office space than 13.9% that is vacant in America, but it's not considered to be vacant because it is still leased. But as these lease rules come up, you see upward pressure on office vacancy. So now you've got many building owners who are suffering higher vacancy, losing rent revenue, and now they have to refinance their mortgage. That's that debt maturity wall that people talk about. $3 trillion of commercial real estate related debt has to be refinanced over the next 5 years, 5-year period beginning with this year. Who's going to refinance that debt? Now again, the office market's not bad everywhere. Many suburban markets are in decent shape. But in certain markets in which you see a lot of lost value, I'll give you an example. About 3 months ago, Wall Street Journal had an article featuring downtown St. Louis. St. Louis is a beautiful, historic American city. The tallest building in downtown St. Louis is the 44-story AT&T building. In 2006, that building sold for $205 million US. It just sold for $3.5 million. Now, there's some losses there. And the point is that could be some banks' collateral. So we care about the building owners, of course, human beings, losing value, taking losses. But also banks might be exposed to some of these losses. And again, particularly in certain markets around the country, these are the highest downtown office vacancy rates in America. San Francisco is screaming towards 40% vacancy. And you may have heard that the company formerly known as Twitter, now known as X, is moving their headquarters out of downtown San Francisco. Now I have some good news from San Francisco, which is the following. My older daughter has been working for me for the last year. She just got a job with Google in San Francisco, which means she comes off my payroll, which is one of the reasons you might notice I'm in such a very good mood. But you can see some of these other markets here. Los Angeles, a massive office market, very high office vacancy. And so, again, there are a lot of banks exposed to this, particularly regional banks that specialize in commercial real estate lending. And again, you see similar situations in other parts of the world. This is the global office vacancy in certain regions around the country. The green colored bar, fourth quarter of 2019. So just before the pandemic starts to take down the global economy, blue colored bar, second quarter of 2024. So around 4.5 years later. And you can see vacancy is up everywhere, including in North America, but throughout the world, because remote work is a phenomenon around the world, of course. So where does that take us? The outlook for the economy? United States, Canada, and the rest of the world. Now, this is Clint Eastwood from the Dirty Harry films. There are 5 Dirty Harry films. The first one shows up in 1971 called Dirty Harry. The character's name is Harry Callahan. In that first movie, Harry Callahan has a partner. The partner's name is Chico Gonzalez. And Chico Gonzalez was played by an actor who later showed up in stand-up shows, playing the part of Poppy, the unhygienic restaurateur. Just a movie and TV history, which apparently none of you has any interest. So let me continue on. Leading indicators. So again, the consumer, in both the United States and Canada, of course, but consumer depends on the strength of the labor market. You've heard, of course, recently many large-scale layoff announcements by larger firms, Google, Tesla, Amazon, so on and so forth. So as is often the case, we'll depend upon smaller firms to create net new jobs. But in many cases, small firms are the most pessimistic firms. A recent survey asked the question, is it a good time to expand your business over the next 3 months? And they asked this to small business operators. In that survey, only 4% of small business operators said, yes, it's a good time to expand my business. It's not a good time for them because they're dealing with all kinds of inflation pressures, can't find the right sets of workers, so on and so on, high interest rates. So the hires rate, which is the number of hires in any given month in the United States divided by the number of people receiving a paycheck, has been falling. Again, more indication that the labor market is starting to get sloppier, starting to slow down. And by the way, even though unemployment in the United States has fallen over the last couple of months, it's still risen over the course of a longer period of time. So the cyclical, the year for unemployment in the US was 3.4%, it's not 4.1%. I showed you those unemployment rates for Los Angeles and Chicagoland and so on and so forth, Chicago metropolitan area. And so this rise in unemployment is actually triggered what's called the Somm Rule Recession Indicator. Now this indicator was created by a very, very clever economist, Claudia Somm, who, while working at the Federal Reserve in 2019, created a rule. And I'll summarize the rule for you in the text box, but it gets at how rapidly unemployment is rising over a 12-month period. And again, unemployment begets unemployment. When the factory up the street lays off workers, the retailers along Main Street are going to probably lay off workers too. The spending part is spending, which means fewer jobs at the restaurant, the dry cleaner, so on and so forth. And so when the labor market starts to see rising unemployment, the labor market will become disorderly. Now this index structure is such that any reading of 0.50 percentage points or more signals that either recession is here or forthcoming. And applied to data back to the 1970s, it's been coincident with every recession. The reading, as it turns out for September, 0.5. It's ambiguous. But again, indications that this US economy might continue to soften is another theoretical indicator. This is actually the Conference Board's Index of Leading Economic Indicators. 10 leading indicators in its own right, all bundled in one composite index being graphed for you here. It's an index that predicted the 2001 recession, predicted 07, 08, 09. So I'm telling you something more wicked this way comes. And again, in manufacturing, many people have already experienced some of this. You know, some of these metrics related to US and Canadian manufacturing suggest these segments have already been in some decline over the last year plus. This same broader economy is set to slow further. And again, my thesis is that this is the lag effects, or these are the lag effects from these higher interest rates into fully permeate the economy, and we're starting to feel the effect of that now, the theoretical effect, more forcefully in the economies of North America presently. So that takes me, as it turns out, to, I'm going to skip that slide, this. So some of these leading indicators are negative, but many economists will tell you the economy is going to be fine. Actually, the majority of economists will tell you that the economy is going to be fine in both the United States and Canada. These are major economic forecasts for world GDP growth. The yellow colored bar there is 2024's outlook. The blue colored bar is 2025. And the first set of bars relates to the left, relates to the International Monetary Fund. Second set of bars is World Bank. Third set of bars is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the advanced economies of the world. But no one really has a terrible global economy in their forecast going forward, despite all these geopolitical issues that we face. And this is, as it turns out, the outlook for the US economy. Again, blue colored bar is 2025, green colored bar here is 2024, the current year. Now, the outlook is for the US economy to soften. I think that's absolutely true. But a lot of economists say, look, why would we worry about recession? The US economy has demonstrated an ability to manage through or navigate the higher interest rates we've been facing. Certainly it can handle the lower interest rates to come. That's sort of a conventional view out there. My view is that this economy is over-leveraged. That if you look at what's been driving the US economy in particular, this may be less true in Canada, but certainly true in America. Consumers have taken on a lot of debt. The national government has taken on a lot of debt. We've got this phenomenon in America called private credit. So it's non-bank lending. That has exploded. So there's lots of leverage in the US economy, lots of debt in the US economy. And that makes me kind of nervous, actually quite nervous about the US economy in 2025. So final slide. Go where looking and look where you're going is a line from a recent Clint Eastwood film, 2021's Crying Macho. Was not a box office sensation by any stretch of the imagination, but was a critically acclaimed film. And this is a film, parenthetically, that not only does Clint Eastwood act in, but he also directs and produces. The gentleman has more than 40 directorial credits to his career. He's one of America's most prolific movie directors and also movie composers. Composing the scores for movies like $1 Million Baby and Mystic River. Mystic River, a very sad movie starring the likes of Sean Penn, Timothy Robbins, and Kevin Bacon, of course. And Clint Eastwood is born on May 31st of 1930. So as this movie comes out, he is 91 years old. He dances in this movie. He is old enough to be president of the United States of America. He's been around a long time. This is no joke. And he's still at it. Really quite remarkable. So, to sum it up, we're a heavily or deeply indebted society currently facing high borrowing costs. That is the pessimistic right near-term outlook. You say, but wait, interest rates are falling. What are you saying? I know they're falling. Let me give you an example of some of the dynamics at work here. The Federal Reserve Bank of the United States So after 2001, the US economy exits recession. That recession ended in November of 2001. It happened to be the recession punctuated by 9/11. So 2002, 2003 are years of recovery. By 2004, the Federal Reserve was raising interest rates. 2005, they raised rates some more. 2006, they raised rates some more. Economy looks fine. Housing market is booming, so on and so forth. And actually, in 2007, the Federal Reserve begins to cut interest rates. It's cutting interest rates. When does the crisis occur in America? 2008. It takes the entire global economy down with it. I'm not saying we're headed for anything like 2008. No, that's not my point. My point is that you can have economic weakness even as interest rates are coming down. So interest rates are going to come down. But you can still have economic weakness because interest rates are still high, you still have those lag effects from the previous rate increases and rate regime. Geopolitics for elections don't help, of course. Lots of concern, distraction, and risk. We'll see who's elected in America, Kamala Harris or Donald Trump. Should be very interesting. But one way or the other, policies are going to change. We're going to change administration in Washington, D.C., and that's going to create a bit of chaos, too, just as that transition occurs. So it'll come nearly a year after initially anticipated, but I think recession or something close to recession is coming to America in 2025. Of course, the Canadian economy already has less momentum. So it's possible that you'll see something akin to recession in both economies. Of course, as we know, in many instances of factory performance has already been dwindling in many sectors. So with that, hey, thanks a lot for the opportunity. If you're interested in this kind of information, I have a newsletter at www.sagecon.com. There's a free service here. So I'm not necessarily $5. If you're not interested in the newsletter, please, anytime feel free to go ahead and pound sand. And with that, hey, thanks a lot for the opportunity. It's been a privilege to be with you. Hopefully I've left some time for Q&A. Really delightful to address this audience. I've never addressed this audience before. Hope you'll have me back. But let's go to Q&A now. Thank you so much. And, that's very polite, albeit undeserved. But go ahead. Are there any questions here from this audience? Yes, please, sir.
You never mentioned the national debt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So last I checked the debt clock, which is a couple of days ago, the U.S. national debt is $35.5 trillion. Why didn't I mention it? You might say that's the biggest issue. And by the way, neither presidential candidate from either major party is talking at all about the national debt. In fact, because the election is so close, they're promising goodies, right? Tax cuts and subsidies for small business operators, and so on and so forth. So why didn't I mention this? Well, typically I provide my audiences with a one-year economic outlook because I want to invoice you again. But the national debt is a longer-term issue here. If you look at U.S. Treasury options, selling of 5-year Treasury notes or 7-year Treasury notes, they're quite orderly. In other words, there are enough buyers out there for our bonds to finance our deficits. By the way, our fiscal year budget deficit last year was $1.8 trillion in 1 year. It's $150 billion a month. This is not sustainable, but the crisis is not imminent. It's not, I don't think, a 2024 or 2025 issue, and that's why I didn't bring it up. My guess is, it's just a guess. Because bond prices can change any moment, right? There could be a bond crisis happening right now, but I doubt it. In the 2030s, America is in huge trouble. So this is the roaring 20s for federal government outlays, right? We're spending on subsidies to manufacturers, right? We're going to give $6.6 billion ultimately to TSMC to put 3 fabrication plants in Arizona. We're ready to provide over $8 billion of support to Intel to get their act together, including to build fabrication plants in Columbus, Ohio, and also in Arizona, as it turns out, Samsung and all this. This is a time we're spending on infrastructure. So on November 15th of 2021, President Biden signed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, $1.2 trillion package. So we're spending on water and sewer systems, roads, and so on and so forth. 2030s, money is gone. So at that point, the national debt is well over $40 trillion, of course. Maybe closing in on $50 trillion. Social Security trust fund is going insolvent by that point, so is the Medicare trust fund. America's in trouble. And I would say that, as an American, we send some of our worst people to Washington, D.C. to represent us. And I understand why we do this, by the way. Let's you don't like your neighbor. Hey, have you ever thought about running for Congress? Problem solved. But it makes for very bad policymaking. We don't have Daniel Patrick Moynihan's or anyone like that in Congress anymore. People who could work across the aisle. People who could agree on things. And you would think that one of the benefits of divided government is the federal government would be spending less money. They can't agree on it. They think they're going to spend less money. Some of they spend right through the disagreement. So we're headed for crisis, and I'm quite nervous about the 2030s. And you'll hear many economists, by the way, and I think they're practicing voodoo economics, but they'll say 2030 is the year of the crisis. Because these are economists who believe that every 50 years or 100 years, we have an economic crisis. So you might remember 1980 was a terrible year for the U.S. economy. 1930 was a terrible year for the U.S. economy. 2030 is sort of the next 50-year period. And voodoo economics. There's nothing deterministic about these things. But we are marching as Americans towards price. The Canadians are much more fiscally responsible, whether they realize it or not. But the Americans are completely irresponsible. And we have some problems, but it's not next year, I don't think. Any other questions here? Maybe something a bit more upbeat? Any other people? Going once, twice? No questions? Well, ask a question, how did the Mets win? Yes, question there.
How do you foresee?
There's a microphone coming to you.
Oh, yes. How do you foresee an unstable situation in the Middle East and in Eastern Europe affecting the economy in the near future?
Yeah, right. So, look, one of the things about both of those regions of the world, they're very commodity intensive, right? Middle East is very oil production intensive, for instance. Eastern Europe is very food production and energy production intensive. So why are prices higher? Why is the price of oil in North America today around $73 a barrel? It's because the Americans produce 13.3 million barrels of oil per day, and the Canadians, in a bad year, in 2023, produce 4.6 million barrels of oil per day. This year, the Canadians, thanks to the lack of wildfires, will produce more than 5 million barrels of oil per day. So the North American economy, because we produce so much for ourselves, do we produce steel and aluminum? We produce steel and aluminum. Do we produce oil and natural gas? We produce oil and natural gas. Do we produce our own food supply? We do. America's a net exporter of food. So because of that, these raging wars in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, conflict in East Asia, of course, you can see things heating up between the North Koreans and the South Koreans, the Chinese and the Taiwanese. And yet the Americans and the Canadians, who were, the Canadian economy is one of the largest in the world. Last I checked, 10th largest economy in the world. America's first. Massive economies, relatively insulated, and so, yeah, we'll see these geopolitical events continue to rage forward, but because we North Americans produce so much for ourselves, and because, by the way, supply chain is coming back home to North America. And for such a long time, we thought, at least in the United States, we're going to become a service sector-oriented economy. All the production is going to go someplace else. That's why people spend so much time getting jobs. We don't have enough machinists. We don't have enough mechanics. We don't have enough welders. We don't have enough HVAC people. We don't have enough pipe fitters. We don't have enough electricians. Blue-collar jobs are growing very rapidly. We don't have enough of these people. And something similar is happening in Canada. So I have not really built in a lot of these geopolitical events into my forecasts. Always a risk, right, of something major happening, so major that it would affect the North American economy. But by and large, these conflicts have occurred, and Americans have continued to go on vacation, continue to spend at Nordstrom or on Amazon, or whatever it happens to be. So I really haven't built that in. So that's another downside risk, but I have not built it into my baseline forecast. Any other questions here from the audience? Excellent question, thank you. And the previous one was as well. Yes, sir.
Okay, so with all this said, what would you invest in?
Okay, question is, what would I invest in today with all this said? I tell you, I'm nervous. I think the U.S. equity markets are overstretched. Price-earnings ratio on the S&P, even before yesterday, is 21. I think there's a fair amount of complacency in the marketplace. Look, I haven't sold anything so far in the cycle. But I think it's not a horrible time to take some risk off the table financially, to sell some equities, and you're still getting a pretty good yield on bonds, especially municipal bonds. So a lot of cities around America are in very good financial shape. And those municipal bonds have a nice yield, sometimes off over 5%. It would have been a lovely thing to buy 10-year Treasury notes when they're yielding 5%, right? 5% a year for 10 years, guaranteed. But many people didn't take that opportunity. But still, if you look at municipal bonds, high-quality municipal bonds, I think there's a chance there. So I would invest more on the bond side, take some money off the table in terms of equity. Yes, I would have some money in Bitcoin, by the way. I've become a believer. And I think that there's an opportunity also to rotate into international equity, whether it's Canadian stocks or European stocks, because the U.S. stocks seem to be particularly overvalued relative to the rest of the world. So to the extent that there's equity exposure, I would rather have more international exposure at this point, relatively speaking, to the current portfolio than U.S. exposure. Because I think it's the U.S. where we really see equity valuation stretched too significantly. Again, because there's been a lot of complacency about the debt accumulation here. I hope that helps. And the question, by the way, also gold is not a bad asset. I'm a huge fan of gold. Can you tell? After the presentation, I'll show you my navel. It's spectacular. So that's been, I just know gold has been at a 2,500-year high recently, trading around 2,700. So I think, given the world is a very shaky place, Having, some money in things like gold, which would tend to burst higher if the world became even more chaotic, it's not a bad place to be. Any other questions here from this audience? Oh, yes, please. Microphone is coming to you. Yes, sir.
I know they not the relevant view of since it's a very political movement and interesting issue. Canadian perspective, the Keystone Pipeline is a major project the Canadian government is trying to pursue. What do you think that which has been suspended? So far, I don't know why it was suspended or just a joke. It's just a start. It's a huge impact on the Canadian economy and between the United States and the Canadian home as a basically mobility tool. And then that related with our customers and plus the construction market as well. So, I mean, I'm not asking that the definite answer or anything like that, but what do you think that the view about this Keystone Pipeline project is going to go up again or not in the future with the new politically changed map in the United States? What do you think?
All right, great question. Question about the Keystone Pipeline, something that ultimately would more firmly join the U.S. and Canadian economies as it turns out. As much as this is going to happen, you might as well ask the question, is Donald Trump going to be reelected? Because if Donald Trump is elected, it goes forward. Done. If Kamala Harris is elected, I doubt it goes forward. It's as simple as that. It's not about our relationship to the Canadians or friendship, it's just about different worldviews. On the left side of the spectrum in America, it's about clean energy, green energy, so on and so on, getting away from fossil fuels, so on and so on. On the right side, it's maybe, from some perspectives, a more pragmatic approach. Fossil fuels are still important, natural gas is very inexpensive way to produce electricity. Americans are already having a tough time paying their bills. We need to be practical about these things. And by the way, we're not sure that we're even causing global warming. So, is what some people would say. So, that's the question. Now, it'll be a very tight election. You look at Kamala Harris is vastly outraising money relative to Donald Trump, and she's leading a lot of the polls with key states, Pennsylvania, Nevada, Arizona, so on and so on. But we're going to get that November 1st jobs report. It's going to be terrible. That's my guess. We'll see if that has any influence, but a lot of people will say to the pollster, I'm not voting for Donald Trump, and then they vote for Donald Trump. So I don't know, because I don't trust the polls at all. I trust polls often normally when Donald Trump is not involved. When Donald Trump's involved, you cannot trust the polls. So it's going to be very close, and if he wins, that Keystone Pipeline will come online pretty quickly. And that means lots of jobs in the American Midwest, as it turns out. It's not just about a Canadian issue, of course. It's an American economic issue, and so it just comes out of that. That's as simple as I can answer. Any other questions for this audience? Make something a bit less political? Anybody, or whatever. Any other questions? Going once, twice? Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you.